are so happy to have Edwidge Danticat with us today. Welcome, Edwidge.
There it is. Good afternoon. Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Alex. Thank you all for having me.
So, we're going to have a conversation. So when did you write this play? Let's start with there. Like, how did it start, and what inspired it? I think everyone knows what inspired it, but why did you write a play instead of a short story or a novel about the earthquake and its issues? Its issues.
So soon will be the 10th anniversary of the earthquake in Haiti, and it was obviously a massive event for us. And so there was a moment right after the earthquake, and I, in a smaller scale, I had a similar feeling right after each of my parents passed away, where you feel like there's not, like you can't really make sense of it enough to create something out of it. And there are parallels I see in, I was in New York doing 9/11, and often they were saying, okay, the journalists first, then the poets, but to make fiction out of something, then you have to, get individuals to embody certain ideas, to say things, you have to create characters. So that felt very hard to do. And so then I started taking notes, and I thought, so it wasn't really right after, but it was a couple of months after, around Bastille Day, which is the title of the play, when there was this announcement that was made that the French government was going to pay Haiti repay this debt that really after Haitian independence, Haiti had to pay France for its loss of property, which included people who were colonized by them and enslaved by them. And so after Haitian independence, Haiti had to pay what then became the equivalent at that time of $21 billion for its independence, and they were paying it for almost, over almost a century. So, and this was announced like it was real, it was announced that, they're going to pay back. And then there was a discussion, it's like the reparations discussion right now. If they're going to pay back, who are they going to pay back to? And then it turned out to be a hoax, but for a second people believed it. And then so people started forming about, like, that I could write something about. But I didn't, I wrote a short story about it, and then I imagined it as something that, like, develops in a conversation, because we talk a lot about politics. Like, Haitian people really talk a lot about politics. And sometimes it sounds like we're having, arguments, but it's like we're just passionately discussing politics. And I thought this would be a good framework for that, of the people having a heated conversation. And there's always that conversation, especially this week, as very difficult things are happening in Haiti. Do you go? Do you stay? What should we do? And so I thought like it would be interesting to build a kind of conversation and a play around these elements: Bastille Day, the earthquake, and then also a kind of love relationship.
And just for maybe some people who are wondering, why is it called Bastille Day?
It's called Bastille Day because it takes place on Bastille Day for the French. And that announcement, Bastille Day, I guess, is like the French for the 4th of July. And that announcement was made at that time as a kind of grand gesture. So, I ended up writing a short story about it, which is in my new book, Everything Inside. And then the short story version is set on 4th of July.
So some of the themes that we talked about were about disaster capitalism and about loss and hope. And could you talk a little bit about the theme about destructive capitalism?
Yeah, I think a good companion piece to the play would be Raoul Peck's documentary Fatal Assistance, which is about what happens after disasters, and it's what happened after Katrina, what's going to probably happen big time in Puerto Rico. What happens is that suddenly there are people who swoop in and see a kind of investment opportunity in the fact that the people who lived in this place, especially if they were poor people, are suddenly displaced, and so during Katrina, people were shipped out to Houston, and they were hoping they would never come back, and suddenly then their areas get developed, and then you see the same thing like with eyes on Puerto Rico. Minori Klein wrote a book on disaster capitalism that I think is also sheds light on that, and of course in Haiti, it was initially like the whole push, we're going to give like $13 billion made and all the pledges, and then nothing was really followed through on.
And it also happened in one of the documentaries I watched. It also happened in Sri Lanka after the tsunami, where people lived on the beach for decades, and then once that tsunami happened, sort of business came in, and the governments pretty much sold their land to big businesses. Is this the first play you wrote?
I wrote 2 plays before that when I was in graduate school, and one was, so when I was a teenager, there was a teenager in New York, Yusuf Hawkins, who was murdered he went in through this Bensonhurst, through kind of a predominantly Italian neighborhood, and he was chased down and killed by a bunch of young white guys. And so I wrote a play about him that was produced at Brown when I was a student there. And then I wrote another really terrible play, which was about a mom who's trying to be a stand-up comic, but neglects her child, and then something terrible happens to the child, but she keeps telling jokes about it. And that play didn't really work at all because it was kind of the balance between the horror and sort of what the stuff she was saying just never quite clicked. But that experience, just gave me the appreciation for, I'm used to, the way my method works as a story writer, as a fiction writer, I'm so used to writing something, and maybe, my editor sees it, and we, make suggestions, but this medium is super collaborative, and whereas when you write fiction, it's a very solitary, you're the god of everything. You create it, and then, but this requires, and then I've seen it both times, and those were much more limited experience than this, but just there's so many people working through it in a way that I get to decide what everybody does when I'm writing my stories, on the page.
Did you miss not being in the room?
No, I didn't. Actually, that's one thing they kept saying, and I feel like this is a deficit in this process because I'm in Miami and you were here, and one thing they kept saying to me at Brown in this production is you want to be there, but I'm not. I also in the process of writing, novels or short stories, you're so used to letting the characters go. You're be well, travel your path on your own, and you expect that there's a different movie in everybody's head, right? You're not in, whereas the theater, you're presenting a canvas, forgive the pun in this case, but and people are looking, you're giving them something specific to look at. They can imagine other things around it, but you're giving them a fixed picture. Where if you're writing a short story, you're writing a novel, everybody sees develops images based on their own experiences, their own exposure, and I always think about the fact that for a lot of people, they'll have to really imagine what Haiti is. They may not know any Haitian people, so they're forming a whole picture, not just based on the words, but whatever they've heard, whatever they've read. So it's a collaboration in that sense too, but it's a collaboration with an imagination, and with the person's imagination. It's that thing between reader and writer. But with the theater, it's it's like a film. You're offering them a definitive visual.
Well, I know I missed you, big time. Just because I love having the playwright in the room. It's so much easier to go, is that right? Or what does that mean? I know we've exchanged emails, and you've been great with your crazy book tour schedule and responding, and even once in a while sending me little bits of music, which was amazing. Do you know I know Natalie, by the way?
What?
I know Natalie.
Oh, you
I went to Juilliard with her.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I connected
Wow.
with that. A song she sent me that I fell in love with that's in the play.
Oh, wow. So that made it easier to get the right to use it, I assume?
I guess so. So the first, I'm not going to, can you guys hear me? Yeah? Okay, great. So the first time I read the play, it was about like 130 pages or 120 pages long. And then a few months later, I got a different draft, and it was about 48 pages with different elements in it. What was that process like, and why did you shorten it? And was there, I don't know.
Well, I mean, it's also, I mean, one of the things about working in different genres, one does, like, I don't have the same ease or even the same competence in every genre I work with. Like, if I started writing poetry tomorrow, I would expect my initial poems to suck, right? So, so this one, it was almost like writing the play. It was almost like, oh, I want to write this play. I feel like this would, and so it ended up being like the first draft was super chatty. I mean, maybe this one is still chatty, but it was just like they were saying everything they were thinking. And sometimes you know the principles, because I know from writing fiction that you don't say everything up front, and you kind of have to leave space for the reader. You kind of have to have nuance and layers, and what Hemingway called like that iceberg. I'm sure a lot of you have read that story, Hills Like White Elephants, where it's like, where he said, you know, Hemingway, like 1/8, like 7/8 of the story was not stated, and then you can have the load of trying to figure things out to the nuance. And I didn't have that competence in the playwriting. I mean, I think it's something that I'm still developing. It's a risk that I'm taking in terms of trying out a new genre. So after reading it, you know, another time when it was like, oh, these people are, like when they said, oh, they might actually do it, I'm like, oh my God. It's like, you know, then feeling a little bit like, you know, exposed, and I thought, let me go back and revise it. And then I wanted to, one of the things that I felt like I wanted to do, and maybe that I might want to do even further, is like tighten it up a little bit, you know, and like leave more unsaid.
For those that might not know about the earthquake, can we just talk about like what that was and the numbers of like how many people, the devastation of it? Well,
it was one of the worst natural disasters in this part of the world, you know. So it was a 7.1 earthquake on January 12, 2010. And something like and I don't know if they'll fully know, but the numbers that circulated was like 300,000 people died, and 1.5 million people were you know, displaced, living in tent camps all over, certainly all over Port-au-Prince, but also, you know, near towns like Jacmel and Léogâne, and you know, just destruction of infrastructure, buildings that never, you know, came up again. They'll probably, you know, you'll probably, you know, as we approach the date, especially since it's the 10th anniversary, you'll get a lot of the tallies and how far have we gone, and then some people even, you know, this week with all the, there's a lot of demonstrations right now in Haiti, people demonstrating against the government, asking the president to resign. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of evaluations like, have we gone any far? Is this worse than before? And so there'll be that whole kind of analysis. But for a lot of people like myself, I lost 2 family members and many friends.
And in the sense of like, there's the Reconstruction Council that's in the play, and the complications of that. Is there anything that you want to go into?
Well, again, like I think one fatal, you know, the Raoul Peck documentary does a really good job of tracing that, and so there was this council led by Bill Clinton that was supposed to be, because for a long time now, you know, the narrative about governance in Haiti is that it's so corrupt that we can't really hand them money. And so then Bill Clinton was kind of supposed to be in charge of this council, which included some Haitians and other foreigners, and then they were supposed to invest this money, this 13 billion, I think they had promised, like different countries had pledged money for the reconstruction, and this council was supposed to distribute that money, but what ended up happening, I mean, what we have like 9 years later is that, so the Red Cross, they're not part of the council, but in terms of like, taking up, tallying, so the Red Cross they got something like, I think they got over $500 million, and they built 6 houses. There was a report on ProPublica about that. And so just like all the waste and incompetence and just not on the part of the government, which was, this council was created to keep them from getting access to that money, but it still ended up being wasted, and then the council sort of dissolved. But the premise of the play is that it would have been considered a kind of honor for somebody who's politically minded, who wants in, who wants to be like, oh, there's all this money that's going to be, at play. You want one of your people there to kind of give out the contracts and do all the deals, and so that's something that could certainly happen. I think this happened here. We're talking about that all week, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And in that Raoul Peck documentary, there's a few moments where I know the Haitian representatives, they were voicing the concern that their voice wasn't being heard, even within these meetings.
Yeah. And how much of figureheads are you in these kinds of situations, right? I think that's sort of the structure of people in the developing world who, when aid comes, and often people are rarely asked, well, what do you need? The people with the purse come in and they say, I think you need this. I think you need a hospital. I think you need that. I think you need what I would need. And once the people are not consulted, and then when the thing fails, then the people on the ground are blamed for the lack of sustainability of the project that was imposed on them. For example, one project, my mother-in-law lives in a town in the south, and they started, this really well-meaning NGO comes in, and they're like, okay, we noticed that a couple of girls are pregnant and they look really thin. We're going to start doing a program where we feed pregnant girls. And what do you know? In 9 months, a lot more girls are pregnant, right? So they can get the food. And then the older women in the town saying, we told you that wouldn't be a good way to solve the problem.
And to go back to the debt, I remember in my research, how long did it take Haiti to pay back that?
So it was post 1804. It went I think it went a little bit into the 20th century.
Yeah, like 1940 something.
Yeah. It went through the American occupation. The American occupation also involved like the U.S. going and taking hold of Haiti's purse. Yeah, and I think they might have even paid a little. Been like. That's one of the things that when they took away the purse that they all were also paying. So it was very hard, to frame the whole thing. So when Haiti became independent in 1804, there's still enslaved people in this country. And it really upset like Thomas Jefferson and the rest because they thought it was a really bad example to have like so close by this nation of enslaved people who had overthrown their masters and had created a republic. And it was agreed, and it's in some of Jefferson's papers, it's like this cannot succeed because you have enslaved people here who will look at that and then start their own, revolution. So Haiti was completely isolated. It was embargoed, really, as sort of because it was a bad example to enslave people because it would have turned over if people had followed through, if it had this domino effect, which the Haitians leaders wanted, it would have, it wouldn't have been good for the world order that existed, especially in the hemisphere, because Haiti and the United States were the first republics, period, in this hemisphere. And one where enslaved people were ruling, and another was where there were still people who were enslaved and fighting, certainly, for their freedom in different ways. But the leaders here in the United States of America felt like the fact that there was that example so close by was bad. So they didn't do any dealing with Haiti. At the same time, Haiti, then, for example, then whatever resources they had, they shared with people like Simon Bolivar, and they said, like, there's only one thing we ask of you, is that you go and free people wherever they're enslaved in the Americas. So it was set up, to fail.
Yeah. What I found interesting in my research was that the actual revolution cost Napoleon so much money that he had to sell the Louisiana Purchase.
Mm-hmm.
So America would not be America if it wasn't for the Haitian Revolution.
Yeah, and back then, Napoleon's army, which was fighting the East, was the most powerful army in the world.
Yeah. Anything you want to know about our process of working on this play without you there?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for taking it on. We had a meeting in New York where we tried to exchange ideas as much as possible, and I did realize that there was the fact that you were taking it on really, it's like a stand-in for whatever, I would have contributed was very brave. What I wanted to, I want to know what made you want to take on, what made you want to do it?
Well, when I was asked if I was available, they gave me the script, and I was extremely busy, and I didn't read it right away, and I kept getting phone calls, and then Rebecca Rudd finally cornered me and said, I need to know by this weekend. And as I'm fighting 2 other deadlines, I just got on my treadmill and read the 130-page version.
You can read on your treadmill.
I walk really slow, but I get my steps. And the first thing my reaction was like, wow, this is long. Also just because I know the time frame of the slot, because I directed The Aliens like 2 years ago, and it's compact, and there's a lot of political stuff that I was like, oh yeah, what, okay, well, I need to research that. It was overwhelming at first, just of like how much work I had to put into it, and then by the time I got to the end, I was actually sobbing. There was a sense of, I really latched onto Philippe saying I lost all hope. Like, that killed me. And it killed me that the hoax was fake, because I didn't know that the hoax was fake. Well, that it was a hoax. Yeah, I was on my treadmill like at 8 o'clock in the morning, just crying. And, I was in school as well during 9/11 at Juilliard, and that event sort of, shattered's not the right word, but it destroyed something in me. Like, something shifted. I almost stopped directing because of it. I was working on Pericles, and my twin sister and my other sister's fiance were down at the site rescuing people. So it just seemed what I was doing didn't make sense. And I almost walked out of Juilliard actually, and then someone there convinced me to stay until December. But that, it just messed up my worldview a little bit. It kind of like messed up my own personal views of things, and there was during that time there was a sense of I was living with a really close friend of mine who's hardcore activist, and I was hanging out with him like 2 days after, and there was a lot of like conversations about the theories of what was happening and the politics of what was happening, and I was stuck on the personal. And so that also was interesting about your play, about the personal and the political, and how you, with such a big event like that, like an earthquake or a tragedy or a devastation, how does one continue with the personal when all this loss of humanity. So I knew that it hit me in the right place, and then I knew I had to connect this to that. And then I was like, okay, so, and then Rebecca was like, you know, Edwidge would probably not be involved because she's going to be in a book tour. But I kept emailing you, so thank you. And then I just took it as, okay, I'm doing Julius Caesar. I don't know anything about ancient Rome. I didn't live there. So I'm going to do due diligence. And
you can't talk to Shakespeare.
And I can't talk to Shakespeare. But I know his cousin. That was the main reason. It's just like that moment of like, I might have not known all the politics and history, but I kind of sensed the soul of it. And I was hoping that was enough to get me into it. So yeah, that was my reaction, and that's why I said yes to it. And actually, directing Aliens here 2 years ago, I really fell in love working with these students. I think they're very talented, and I think I have a very talented cast who've been great to work with. Very intimate, very just sifting through all the political and all the stuff that, as Americans, we might hear differently. Like some of my notes was, you know, we say Civil War and it's something different, right? We say coup, it's something different. Actually, the president just recently said coup in the wrong way. But there's like, just remembering that we were, as Americans, taking on a story, and that there was a certain shift of our lens that we had to make. Our first 3 rehearsals, I think we just watched a bunch of documentaries that I found about disaster capitalism, about the earthquake. Because how old were you guys when that happened? The earthquake? Like 9, 10. And then about the coup and Aristide and all that stuff, like, they might have heard the names, but to actually see those images and hear about that interesting history took us time. And by the time we got to tech, we're like, were we staged at all? No, we were not staged.
Nope.
No. Yeah. That's Travis. He plays Philippe.
Travis really wanted us to hear that note.
And Travis was great because he's actually half Haitian, so he was able to like reach out to family members, and if we had any questions that we, you know, if there was a lapse in communication between the two of us, he would just get on the phone.
It's like last age.
Like I said.
And then I had a few friends of my sister who are Haitian, so I would just call them and text them. And it was interesting. I think it was just a really intimate and sort of kind of emotional, and it was intense. It was intense.
And I think probably you just based on their responses, like you had less time than you would have liked, probably like the shortened.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Even though like the play runs about an hour 15, so they got cast the first week of school, second day of school, and we went into rehearsal the next day. So they might have read the play during the summer, but they didn't do any research. So like we were really starting at zero, and I totally forgot about that. So it was that was a challenge of them kind of knowing the events and the politics. So we went down some rabbit holes. It made our stage manager very nervous about like how fast we were going. But I wanted to take care and make sure we knew exactly what we were saying and why we were saying it. And it's very talkative, right? So the main thing was like to make sure it wasn't sounding expositional and active. That was our main thing. But yeah, I think I said this when we met. I was like, this is a new work. I was treating it, and knowing that sort of the timeline, I was like, I had to go into this thinking of it as a workshop, and what will I learn, and what will we take away from it? Going, oh, that choice did not work, and And that's why I keep telling them every night. Like every night they go up, I'm like, just take these notes and see what else you can find. So hopefully Friday when I see it again, it's gonna be a little, not a lot different, but a little different.
Do they want to say anything?
Yeah, do you guys want to say anything about the process or?
Well, I mean, we had 3 weeks to do it, and I think, like, reading the play, because we needed so much backstory on it, so a lot of that we had to fill in, like, while we're on our feet, because, like, I know the audience is probably not gonna have that much knowledge about the play, so we had to do a lot of research to make sure that that was filled, so that hopefully the audience would catch on to, could follow what we were doing. I love the Spirit Children because I'm never, when we hear like
Spoiler alert.
But when we hear of voodoo, there's always like we have such a bad connotation on it, especially in America. So it's good to know that like a person has written it, and so that we can explore it, and so that another ear can know that it's not just bad, or it's not just a demonic thing as what we know it as. Even some Haitians know it as that, but yeah.
How about you?
Yeah, I think for me, for those who are not here, it just sticks to me every time. And there was one moment during our rehearsal process, Alex had put on a board, Busan Paweo, for those who are not here. And we took a moment to reflect on our lives and reflect on people and the culture and the world itself, and started adding to that list of those who are not here, and of those who have, dealt with devastation and dealt with those things, and going into this process, that has always been there for me, and I was very grateful to be a part of this, and very grateful to share that with my scene partners, and share that, and let the story fill that, and yeah.
Yeah, there was a moment in rehearsal where, right before I wrote that on the board, for those who aren't here, we were working on that moment, and as directors do, they get up and like, well, let's try it this way. And I was sort of working with Travis a little bit, and for some reason, I said the words, and I literally, it hit my soul, and I broke down. And I started, and I couldn't talk, and Travis, we had to take a 5. We didn't take a 5 officially, but we took a 5 within the circle of us. And then the next day, a ladybug was in the room. And I just remember a friend of mine from Hawaii saying that certain insects might represent someone coming to visit you for a reason. And so the third day, I was like, I need to make this part of the ritual of this play and of this rehearsal, to make sure that we're not just doing it for the Haitian people, but also for the people that we've lost and that can also come through to the story and help us tell the story.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because in my house, for example, like if there's a butterfly, my mom would have said like, oh, I wonder who's visiting.
Yeah.
It was like that thing of a presence. But joining like Pusambawayu, for those who are not here, and with what Travis was saying too about rituals and voodoo, I mean, I think just coming here, it's interesting how loss and absence and shape spaces, because walking over here, then we were talking about the college, and Anna was like, there were enslaved people here, and it was a plantation, and for me, that immediately shifted my sense of the place, right? About who's here, and most of the places in America, there are a lot of schools that even do this, that acknowledge the indigenous people who were there before, and I feel like, oh, this one has another layer. We also have to acknowledge that there were enslaved people here before, and what that means now in terms of my being here. So it's a way of framing the work that we do, and I think that's a really good way of embodying certain things, right? Because when I'm writing a character, I don't see a body, and then you all put a body to it. But what we do, especially in kind of remembrance work, in the play and all this work that we do in memory, and in some ways is for those who are not here, right? And especially if you're doing, like a piece like this, it's like you really want to, it's a way of bringing people back, and so I think that was a good way to think about it, like even honoring, right? Because there's a thing in the African diaspora tradition. It's like if you name somebody, they're not gone. Also Coco, they
Right, go for it.
as long as you mention, you call out people's names, like they're still alive in some ways. And my mom, another thing she used to say, like people have 3 deaths: when you surrender your breath, when they put you on the ground, and when people stop calling your name. So, the point of all of this was to call out some names.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we so we're going to maybe open it up to the audience. Not maybe, we are. Yeah, we have a question right there.
Hi, my name is Jonathan, and I saw the play Bastille Day a couple days ago, and it was very, very intriguing. But I noticed in the play the characters found themselves searching for hope, let's say. Because I noticed, like, especially the character like Oscar, let's say, where he like pretty much begged Felipe to, present him later. And it's interesting you were to play. When you watch a play, when you see the play in action, what do you want the idea of like hope or any other theme to give the audience?
Well, I mean, I think the idea of you've had a big major disaster, and I was trying to think, as Alex, as you were speaking, what your communal loss as young people these days is sadly these like the school shootings, or like these big, you've not luckily have like a 9/11 or one of those like massive disasters, but there are ways that in the immediate moment of grieving, and I live in Florida, so when Parkland was very close to in consciousness to us, and so when you're grieving, immediately there's a kind of despair, right? And then some time goes by, and then you kind of hear people saying, I hope then there's something we could retrieve out of that. And that's something I see. You see in the parents who are suddenly on the news all the time. They're like, I want this to have meant something. Like, I don't want this to have happened in vain. So I think that's where the people are looking for the hope, because you have to continue your life, right? You have to put one foot in front of the other. You have to go to the next day. You have to go to the next year. But then you want, like, you're hoping that it gets lighter, the burden. And so I think these characters are looking for hope, but in different ways. And there's some shady possibilities, like, so there's some crookedness too, and the way that one of the characters wants to manipulate the next. But I think, at least in the ones that have had the most personal losses, they look for the hope in different ways. You can look at it, you can paint it, you can wallow, and then eventually you want to see something at the end. But the hope, these characters are seeking is that, oh, let this have been for some good. It's like the moment Haiti is going through right now. People are like, oh my God, it's really these terrible things, but let's hope that, it can't be for nothing, right? Because then it's just complete despair. You just you pray and hope that there's something better at the end of it. And not everybody's going to have, is going to express that hope in honorable ways. And some people it's going to be like, oh, me and mine. But then there will be other people who will think communally and how we can all move forward together.
Where does the play go from here?
We don't know.
Well, I'm hoping that, tomorrow you're watching it, right? So I'm hoping that we can have a conversation. I'm hoping that she can see what works, what's working, and then we can have a discussion about that. I think there's something beautiful in it, and I think I think it should have a life, honestly, and I hope you watch and learn what we learned, and I think, yeah, I think I'm taking this as a learning process of what this play can be, and hopefully.
Yeah, and one of the things that that is wonderful about this process, which is also relatively new to me, is that it's a living process, which is very different than printing a book, right? And then it's done. You know, you might be able to change a few things. So that's what I'm really interested in seeing, sort of like, yeah, and then that the fact that, I mean, you can tweak it a little bit from night to night is very exciting to me, because I'm always like, even after we publish something, they're always like, oh my God, I wish I had another chance at it. So that's new, but also exciting, and to see, I mean, it's already like beyond what I thought would happen with it, to have had like actual people and all this thoughtfulness go into it that we've heard from all three of them. So I'm excited to take it in, almost like outside of myself, and then see what can be done with it next.
Hi, my name is Hada. I read Claire of the Sea Light in the spring, and I thought it was a really fantastic novel. For those of you who aren't familiar, Claire of the Sea Light deals with most concisely trauma and the ways in which trauma continues to reverberate throughout many people's lives. And I found myself as a college student wondering about, because some totems I felt, not totems, but like structures of trauma kept popping up in the book. I found myself wondering about structures of trauma that pop up in the lives that we lead as college students, specifically, like you were saying, institutions that either held enslaved people or are on indigenous land. And I was considering, how do we acknowledge that where we are is a spot of trauma that continues to inflict on people when we think about, considering Black bodies moving through higher education. How do we then take those concentrated spots of trauma to open up dialogue so that the pain stops reverberating and that it has space to escape almost? Because I think the novel fiction is wonderful in that it creates space for us to have dialogue like that, but we don't always have the book that will tell us how to deal with our trauma or how to even speak our trauma into existence. And that's just something I've been thinking about a lot as higher education continues to go through all types of censorship and disaster.
Well, I think the thing about trauma, whether it's communal trauma or individual trauma, is that we have to remember we don't have to go through it by ourselves. You don't have to solve it by ourselves. And for some of us, just like we inherit generational trauma, right? And we move about that in the world, and we get, you can get re-traumatized, if you will. But I think it's important to know that you don't have to go through it by yourself, and that they are certainly allies, but you seek, community to share it with, and also to help you with it. And then to find ways of expression, in the way this play was a way to kind of deal with the loss that I was feeling, and the modes of expression to deal with it, and just speaking your truth is another way to do it. But certainly art, absolutely. And I think that's why a lot of people, there's so much complexity and trying to pin down certain things, but you can read someone's work that has nothing to do with your experience, oh, that's what Alex was saying, and it can hit you right here. And to also honor that and share that with other people and share our stories, right? Share with other people what your story is, because there are people who are ill-meaning, but there are people who just don't know.
How did your upbringing affect the stories that you write and how you write them?
Well, I was born in Haiti, as Anne said in the introduction, and I grew up during a dictatorship. My parents had to, because it was a 30-year dictatorship. And so there was a kind of silence around, like things that I was supposed to, like if you're a kid, you knew that there were things you didn't talk about, things you didn't say. But at the same time, I had very lively storytellers in my family. People who just were, who were kind of stern with kids, but once they were telling a story, a folktale, came to life. So I would see in the faces of my aunts and my grandmother the power of a good story. And not just the way they told it, but the way they also listened to it. And so I was like, I want to do that. But I wasn't, I was a shy child. So when I got my first book, which was the Ben Osmond's Madeline, in a house in Paris that was covered with that. That was like the first book I ever got when I was 4. And I thought, I don't know how books got made. I didn't know how that happened, but I was like, oh, I want to do that. I want to help somebody connect both with the oral storytelling, but also with this more intimate written kind of story, where you can. So I knew then that I wanted to tell stories, and I do think that the elders in my family, the way they told stories, because like if they were telling a story and you seemed bored, they would start singing. It was like the whole engagement. I feel like that was like my first lesson in writing. But then I realized the execution for me was more comfortable in a book rather than, in this way of what they do, reciting words.
So, my name's Hannah, and for my Intro to Gender and Sexuality class, we just finished reading her book, Breath, Eyes, Memory. And I wanted to know if you knew anyone that had gone through what Sophie, your character, got through, if you had personally gone through anything that she went through. Especially since I connect to it because my mom was also from Port-au-Prince, Haiti.
Ah, okay. So Breath, Eyes, Memory it's my first book. I wrote it, actually, a lot of it when I was in college, like some of you here. And so it's about a girl who moves from Haiti to New York, and she's raised away from her mother by her aunt. And I think what you're talking about, so her mom and her family, they're really it's very important to them that the girls remain virgins, so they test them to make sure that they keep their virginity. I mean, I knew some people that went through. I knew some people who were taken to doctors to make sure. And I was, one of the things that surprised me when I watched, there's an actress, Dorothy Dandridge, who's an African-American actress, and I was watching a biopic about her life, and her mom, like in the movie, was taking her to the doctors to make sure she remained pure. I mean, it wasn't, like when the book came out, a lot of people got very mad at me because I thought, oh, you're saying that about all people who are Haitian. That's not what I was saying. I was saying, like, this is what happens in this family because they're a poor family. And it happens in, people who are not Haitian have come up to me. For the book is now 25 years old and have shared their experience of that if you're in a family or in a society where it's very important for the woman to marry and marry well, and then so what marrying well means, then that's the men who are marrying, you get to decide what the conditions are, and often they include like being pure. So the family is going to fight like hell for you to stay that way so you don't ruin your chance. And the stories of the honor killings and other, and examples like that in other cultures, it's all about like controlling a woman's body because it's not just her body, it's capital for the family, right? It's their way out of poverty sometimes, and so that was definitely what was happening in that particular family. But I caught a lot of help for writing that story.
I thought it was really good.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Hi. So you tend to use fictionalized characters in a situation that's based on the actual historical context, like you mentioned, the earthquakes in Haiti. So I wanted to figure out your process, or like how you choose what elements to fictionalize and which to bring from actual scenarios.
Okay, so what I don't fictionalize is like, for me, so often I get that question is how do you decide what to write as fiction, as nonfiction? For me, nonfiction has a kind of urgency, like something I want to say now. I want to say it right now, and so I'll write an essay, or I'll write an op-ed, or I'll do like some like reported piece, because I feel like I can't wait. You know, it's like that thing, the urgency of now. But the fiction, it takes a little longer because you have to create people, right? They have to have something else about them beyond the mission that you want to give them in your story, right? They can't just exist for your story. So you have to fill them out. They have to have, hobbies. They have to have really lives. Like, even if you don't write about all of that, like even if you're writing about like just maybe a day in their lives, you have to kind of know who they are before you get that little bit of the day. So, so the difference is like, how I decide if I end up writing nonfiction about the things that I feel like I need to say immediately, or that I, in a relatively short period of time, and then fiction takes a lot longer. And going back to 9/11, I remember for a long time people were like, when are we going to have our 9/11 novel, right? And it took a while longer than like the poetry and the rest and the journalism and like the books of reporting. But part of that is, as Don DeLillo, a novelist, was saying, there are times when the reality competes too much with the fiction, right? Like, and now we have videos of everything. We have so many of these images that, if you were, the fiction might pale in comparison to the real images that you're seeing, especially of really terrible moments and tragedies.
I was wondering what your writing process is. For instance, do you write every day? And if so, about how many hours do you write?
I have two girls. I have a 14-year-old and a 10-year-old. So I mostly write when they're in school. But I used to, before that, I used to write at night. That's really my ideal time. If I had my ideal time would be to write at night, because it's very quiet, and that's my preferred time. But as I'm getting older, I find it harder to stay up at night. Enjoy your time in all-nighters now, because after a while you can't really do them anymore. I think we'll do one more.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sally. First of all, I want to thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I want to speak to the Haitian people. So, as a people who gained independence very early on, but especially are economically still oppressed, a solution such as reparations can seem very appealing. However, as exemplified by the hoax, it's not something that's tangible. So in what ways do you think Haiti can gain proper freedom?
In what way do I think Haiti can gain proper freedom? I feel like the question you're asking is being debated right now in the streets in Port-au-Prince and other cities around Haiti. For a year now, there have been all these demonstrations where people have taken to the street to protest against the government, which is very corrupt, which has taken something like $3 billion that they have gotten from oil that they bought at low interest from Venezuela. And that money was supposed to go into projects. It was supposed to go for health. It was supposed to, and it was squandered. It was stolen. And now people are just like, they feel like they've had enough. So I think I don't know if I had the answer. I mean, I feel like people are still inspired that we did it once before. It was a long time ago, but it's a moment, when the Haitian Revolution, when all the odds were against the people. But if you think about it now, I mean, the odds might be bigger with all the, with all the interest in the region, with imperialism, the way it is, and being, we're told we're a poor country, but we have resources that have been sold and bartered, and people are interested in and would do away with the people to have, So, I mean, I think that question itself, that very question you asked, Haitians are trying to figure out right now. And the majority of people are standing up against the power structure to say we want something else. We want a better life. We want to send our kids to school. We want to eat 3 meals a day. We want to eat. We want peace. We want to determine our own future. So it's a very, it's a tough moment. It's very tough right now. But I feel like at its core is that, like, when do we finally get to be free, and when do we finally decide our destiny? Thank you, Alice.